The most powerful ancient weapon left no physical wounds. Long before the first soldier stepped onto the field, commanders were waging a secret war for the human mind itself. This is the forgotten art of ancient psychological warfare, a sophisticated system of influence that shaped empires. By the end of this journey, you will see every modern conflict, from corporate rivalries to online debates, through an entirely new lens. How did a single whisper topple a king? What happens when an army's greatest strength, its spirit, is shattered before the fighting even begins? We are about to uncover the secrets of winning wars without a single physical blow. What does it truly mean to conquer an enemy? This entire strategy rested on a single, profound insight. Real power lies not in the sharpness of a sword, but in the stability of the mind that wields it. Ancient masters of psychological warfare understood this better than anyone. They saw the battlefield not as a plot of land, but as a collective human consciousness, a space where fear and courage, unity and doubt were the true forces to be conquered. In ancient China, the strategist Sun Tzu articulated this with stunning clarity. He wrote that the highest form of generalship was to break the enemy's resistance without any battle at all. 1,000 miles away in India, the statesman Chanakya echoed this very philosophy, teaching that the most effective victory saps the enemy's will to even contest you. This was far more than simple deception. It was a systematic application of pressure against the weakest points in any human group. The first principle was to shatter cohesion. An army that trusts its leaders and its comrades is incredibly resilient, but introduce suspicion or make soldiers question their allegiance, and that strength evaporates into thin air. The second principle leveraged a universal human currency, superstition and omens. In a world governed by beliefs in divine favor, a sudden eclipse, an inauspicious bird sighting, or a prophesied downfall could be more devastating than 1,000 enemy troops. Finally, these commanders mastered the art of narrative control. They shaped the story of the conflict before the first report ever reached the enemy's capital, portraying their own forces as divinely favored and their opponents as doomed. This was a holistic chess game where logistics, terrain, and morale were not separate concerns, but interlocking pieces. By targeting the mind first, they aimed to create a cascade of doubt that would make their eventual physical victory almost a formality. To see how they executed this, we must now look at their most ingenious and chillingly effective tactics. A general's first and most crucial victory was won not with a sword, but with a lie. The ancient art of psychological warfare began by crafting an entire false reality for the enemy, a web of deception so convincing it could dictate their every move. This was the stratagem of deceptive intelligence and masterful misdirection. Commanders understood that an opponent who believes a fiction will march confidently into a trap of their own making. To achieve this, they employed a chillingly creative array of tricks. They would carefully plant false deserters, soldiers who would stumble into enemy lines with a rehearsed story. One day, such a deserter might whisper of famine and low morale in his own camp, luring the enemy into a reckless attack. The next, another would dramatically reveal exaggerated numbers and divine favor, causing that same enemy to hesitate and fortify, wasting precious initiative. The manipulation of physical evidence was just as cunning. An army expecting to be outnumbered might look upon a distant hillside to see a forest of enemy campfires, each one suggesting 1,000 men. Yet in the morning they would find the camps were empty, the fires lit by a handful of soldiers moving quietly through the night. The goal was always the same: to poison the enemy's decision-making process at its source. Perhaps the most audacious examples come from the spies of ancient empires. A trusted double agent would deliver what seemed to be his king's genuine battle plans, sealed with an official mark. The receiving commander, believing he held the key to victory, would arrange his forces perfectly to counter this fictional strategy, only to find his own army surrounded and broken by a completely different approach. In these elaborate games of perception, the truth was the first and most permanent casualty. The battlefield was already decided long before the first soldier fell, because one side was fighting a phantom. The very earth could be turned into a weapon of mass intimidation. Ancient commanders did not merely fight on the land, they commanded it, transforming geography into a theater of fear designed to break an enemy's spirit before a single spear was thrown. The choice of battlefield was the first psychological masterstroke. A general facing a formidable cavalry charge would not meet it on an open plain. Instead, he would lure that proud army into a narrow canyon, where the very strength of their horses became a fatal liability. Trapped between rock walls, the thunderous charge became a confused, clattering jam of panicked animals and helpless riders. In that moment, the enemy soldier realized his greatest asset was now his coffin, and the general opposing him had engineered that despair with nothing more than a clever map. But the manipulation did not stop with selection. These masters of the mind actively reshaped the world to suit their narrative. They poisoned wells not just to deprive the enemy of water, but to signal a ruthless, scorched earth policy that left no room for mercy. They set controlled fires to create vast, choking smoke screens, but the true purpose was deeper. As the acrid haze rolled forward, it did more than blind, it disoriented and terrified. Shapes moved in the gloom, sounds became distorted, and every soldier felt utterly alone, his courage dissolving in the face of an unseen, omnipresent foe. Perhaps the most chilling environmental weapon was the mastery of sound. A general would position his forces in a deep valley, using the natural acoustics as a colossal amplifier. When his troops began their chants and war drums, the sound would echo and multiply, rolling across the landscape not as the noise of a single army, but as the deafening roar of a legion of giants. To the enemy waiting in the distance, it sounded as if the mountains themselves had come to life, marching against them with the favor of the gods. This was psychological warfare at its most primal, turning nature from a neutral backdrop into a hostile, sentient participant. The enemy was not just fighting men, they were fighting the world itself, and how could anyone hope to win that battle? Perhaps the most insidious weapon in this ancient arsenal was faith itself, expertly twisted into a tool of terror. In a world where the line between heaven and earth was thin, a ruler's power was measured not only in soldiers but in perceived divine favor. The third stratagem was a cold, calculated use of omens, prophecies, and outright religious manipulation. Generals and kings employed their own seers, oracles, and priests not merely for guidance, but as active agents in a psychological campaign. Their task was to generate a constant stream of favorable signs for their own side, while simultaneously weaving a narrative of inevitable doom for their enemies. A sudden solar eclipse, a terrifying and unpredictable event, could be framed not as a natural phenomenon, but as a clear signal of a god's wrath directed at the opposing king. The very heavens seemed to turn against the enemy army, casting their entire campaign into a shadow of divine disapproval. This manipulation extended to the animal kingdom. Sacred animals, from the eagles of Rome to the cows of India, might be subtly encouraged to behave in specific ways. An eagle circling the imperial standard was a glorious omen of victory, but if that same bird was seen flying away from the enemy camp, it became a powerful portent of their abandonment by the gods. This tactic exploited a universal and profound human need for meaning and the deep-seated fear of supernatural retribution. It was one thing for a soldier to face a human foe on the battlefield. It was an entirely different and far more terrifying prospect to believe he was fighting against an angry pantheon. This belief created one of two devastating mental states within the enemy ranks. For some, it bred a fatalistic despair. Why sharpen your sword if the gods have already decided your defeat? Their will to fight crumbled under the weight of a prophesied downfall. For others on the manipulating side, it ignited a fervent, almost fanatical belief in their own inevitable victory. They marched forward not as mere men, but as instruments of divine will. In this way, the outcome of a conflict was shaped long before the clash of shields, decided in the silent, fearful spaces of the human spirit. A polished shield wall could be more terrifying than 1,000 drawn swords. The fourth stratagem moved beyond subtle whispers and clever deceptions into the realm of pure, overwhelming spectacle. This was the orchestration of force as theater, a brutal performance designed to shatter an enemy's spirit through sheer, undeniable intimidation. It was not enough to be strong, you had to appear invincible, a force of nature that made any thought of resistance seem not just foolish but insane. Armies understood that the illusion of perfection could paralyze an opponent. They would arrange their legions in flawless geometric formations, thousands of men moving as a single, silent entity. The midday sun would glance off a sea of meticulously polished armor and shields, creating a blinding wall of light that advanced with mechanical precision. To an observer, this was not a group of individual soldiers, it was an unfeeling, unstoppable machine. The goal was to present an image so disciplined and powerful that the enemy would calculate their own odds of victory and find only zero. This psychological assault extended to the weapons themselves, engineered for terror as much as for lethality. War elephants, colossal and alien, were living battering rams whose very footsteps shook the ground. To an infantryman who had never seen such a beast, the sight of a line of these armored giants, their tusks fitted with iron spikes, was the stuff of pure nightmare. Strange siege engines, towering constructions of wood and iron, creaked forward as monstrous symbols of a long and painful siege. Soldiers themselves became actors in this theater of fear, donning grotesque masks or animal skins to appear less than human, more like demons summoned for war. The message was primal and direct. You are not fighting men, you are fighting monsters. Perhaps no one perfected this brutal stagecraft like the Assyrians. Their imperial power was built on a foundation of psychological dominance, meticulously documented on the stone walls of their palaces. These carvings did not just celebrate victory, they served as a permanent public service announcement for any who might consider rebellion. They depicted scenes of relentless conquest, of cities put to the torch, and of leaders being brutally executed in imaginative ways. A visiting diplomat or a conquered chieftain would walk those halls and be subjected to a gallery of horrors, a clear and chilling narrative. Resistance is futile, it screams across the centuries, and this will be your fate. This was not merely cruelty for its own sake, it was a coldly calculated deterrent. By making the consequences of defiance so vivid and terrifying, they aimed to win future conflicts before they even started. The ultimate victory was to watch an enemy army lay down its arms without a fight, their will to resist crushed not by a blade but by a story carved in stone. But the most patient and insidious attack was the one they never saw coming. A fifth stratagem targeted an empire's foundations not with fire and sword, but with silent, creeping scarcity. This was economic and logistical warfare, a campaign to starve both the body and the spirit into submission. While other tactics aimed at the soldier's heart, this one aimed at the civilian's stomach and the king's treasury. By systematically laying waste to farmland, poisoning wells, and burning grain silos, an invader could turn a prosperous region into a barren wasteland without ever facing its army in a pitched battle. Trade routes were severed and ports were blockaded, slowly choking the lifeblood of commerce from the enemy state. The goal was to induce a deep and pervasive despair that would ripple from the poorest farmer all the way to the royal court. Imagine a city under this invisible siege. The bread lines grow longer each day. The price of a single bag of flour becomes a king's ransom. Parents watch their children grow weak from hunger. In this environment, fear transforms into a potent political weapon. The populace, once united behind their leaders, now directs its anger inward. They begin to question the very rulers who promised them protection. Whispers of incompetence and corruption spread like a plague. Why is the king still feasting in his hall while we starve? Factionalism tears the ruling class apart, as nobles blame each other for the crisis and vie for the remaining resources. This strategy masterfully demonstrated the invading force's power from a distance, making the defending government appear utterly impotent. It was a brutal war of attrition against national morale, proving a timeless truth. An army marches on its stomach, and a populace without food is an army without a cause, without loyalty, and without a future. A king's most trusted friend could become his executioner without ever drawing a sword. The sixth stratagem moved the battlefield into gilded halls and shadowed gardens, where warfare was conducted with whispered promises and carefully chosen words. This was the subtle art of diplomatic persuasion and the forging of covert alliances, a psychological game that dismantled empires from the inside out. Skilled diplomats were the elite operatives of this invisible war. Their weapons were not poisoned daggers, but flattery, strategic promises, and veiled threats. Their mission was to seek out the fractures in an enemy coalition and drive a wedge deep into its heart. They would identify the most ambitious or discontented ally in a rival kingdom, then offer him a tantalizing deal. Perhaps a larger share of the conquered lands, a royal marriage, or a promise of independence if he would only withdraw his support at the critical moment. This ancient divide and rule strategy, meticulously detailed by the Indian strategist Chanakya, was psychological warfare in its purest political form. It did not just isolate the primary target, it injected a virulent strain of paranoia and suspicion into the entire enemy command. How could a king sleep soundly when he had to wonder if the general feasting at his table had already been bought by his foe? The true devastation was not merely logistical, it was emotional. The psychological blow of betrayal was catastrophic. Imagine an army, confident in its combined strength, suddenly learning that its most powerful ally has abandoned the cause. Morale, built on a foundation of unity and shared purpose, shatters in an instant. The soldiers feel not just outnumbered, but isolated and profoundly vulnerable. Their cause, once righteous, now feels foolish and doomed. This strategy proved that the strongest fortress could be brought down by unlocking a single, greedy gate. It demonstrated that loyalty was often the most fragile weapon in any arsenal, easily turned to dust by a diplomat's honeyed words and a rival's burning ambition. The final and most potent psychological weapon was the leader who was no longer a man. The seventh stratagem transformed a mortal commander into a living legend, a figure so shrouded in myth and divine favor that his very presence on the battlefield could decide the outcome. This was the ultimate cultivation of the myth of invincibility, a carefully engineered cult of personality that turned a general into a demigod and his army into true believers. The process was a masterclass in ancient propaganda. Bards and storytellers were not just entertainers, they were vital assets. They would travel from village to village, weaving epic tales of the leader's past victories, always emphasizing his impossible courage and supernatural luck. Anecdotes of his childhood, perhaps a prophecy at his birth or a sign from the heavens, were planted and nurtured until they became accepted as common truth. The goal was to create a narrative so powerful that it transcended the individual and became an article of faith. Alexander the Great was a master of this art. He did not merely claim to be a great king, he actively promoted the idea that he was the son of Zeus himself. His official portraits and coins depicted him with the wild, flowing hair and intense gaze of the god, and he deliberately visited oracles to reinforce this divine connection. Similarly, the Egyptian pharaohs were not just political rulers, they were living gods on earth, their authority flowing directly from the pantheon. This myth-making served a devastating dual purpose. For his own soldiers, it generated a fanatical, unshakable loyalty. These men were not just fighting for pay or land, they were marching alongside a fated being, an instrument of the divine will. Their morale became ironclad, their willingness to charge into certain death bolstered by the belief that their leader was protected by forces beyond human understanding. For the enemy, however, the same myth sowed a deep and paralyzing fear. How could a simple farmer, conscripted into service, possibly hope to stand against a son of a god? The battle felt lost before it even began. This psychological conditioning created a self-fulfilling prophecy. An enemy army, already half convinced of its own doom, would often make crucial mistakes, hesitate at key moments, or break and run at the first sign of adversity. They were not just fighting an army, they were fighting a story, and the story was always one of their inevitable defeat. In this final layer of psychological warfare, the true victory was achieved not by killing the enemy soldier, but by convincing him that his death was already written in the stars. A sacred banner falling could break an army faster than any cavalry charge. The eighth stratagem in this ancient psychological war was a direct assault on the very soul of an army, targeting the cultural symbols and insignia that bound soldiers together with a shared identity and purpose. These were not mere pieces of cloth or metal. They were the physical embodiments of a regiment's honor, its history, and its divine favor. To capture or destroy them was to inflict a wound that went deeper than any sword cut. When an enemy's sacred standard was seized in a daring raid, the news would ripple through their ranks like a shockwave. It was not just a loss of a flag, it was a sign that their gods had turned away, that their cause was now cursed. The profound dishonor could paralyze an entire unit, stripping away their will to fight for a leader who had lost heaven's mandate. But the manipulation of symbols could be even more cunning than simple theft. In the thick fog of battle, with visibility reduced to a few feet, a clever commander might order his troops to mimic the war cries or trumpet calls of their enemy. The resulting chaos was devastating. Soldiers would hear familiar shouts and see vague shapes bearing similar shields, only to be cut down by what they believed were their own comrades. This engineered confusion shattered trust and morale, turning the battlefield into a paranoid nightmare where every shadow could be a foe. The most provocative tactic, however, was the deliberate defilement of religious icons. An army might parade a captured statue of the enemy's patron deity, dragging it through the mud or mockingly offering it sacrifices. The goal was to provoke a blind, uncontrollable rage. Seeing their god insulted, soldiers would often abandon their disciplined formations and launch a reckless, emotional charge straight into a waiting trap. Their greatest strength, their cultural pride and unity, was expertly twisted into a fatal weakness. This stratagem demonstrated a chilling understanding of human psychology. By attacking what an army held most sacred, a commander could make brave men feel naked and abandoned, turn comrades against each other, and transform disciplined warriors into an enraged mob. The true victory was won by making the enemy forget who they were. Sound itself was a weapon they could turn on and off at will. The ninth stratagem in this ancient war for the mind was the orchestration of noise and silence, a deliberate manipulation of the sensory landscape to induce confusion, terror, and paralysis. The battlefield was not just a visual spectacle, it was a terrifying symphony conducted by the general. Drummers and trumpeters were not mere signalmen, they were psychological warriors. A relentless, pounding rhythm from thousands of drums did more than relay orders. It created a physical vibration that shook the enemy's very bones. Combined with the deep, guttural chants of advancing soldiers, this wall of noise was designed to overwhelm the senses, making clear thought and coordinated command almost impossible. In that deafening chaos, fear found fertile ground, yet the sudden absence of sound could be even more potent. Imagine an enemy army advancing with thunderous fury, only to stop just beyond arrow range and fall into an abrupt, unnerving silence. The quiet was not peaceful, it was heavy with menace. It forced the waiting soldiers to confront their own racing hearts and worst imaginings. What were they planning? Why had they stopped? This unbearable tension, drawn out over minutes, could fray nerves more effectively than any frontal assault. The Romans perfected this auditory control. Their legions would advance in near total quiet, their discipline a terrifying contrast to the usual chaos of war. Then, at a precise moment, they would slam their swords against their shields in a single, unified crash. The sound was not just loud, it was a calculated declaration of perfect order and ruthless intent. It told the enemy they were not facing a rabble, but a single, monstrous entity. On the other hand, some commanders chose to weaponize total silence. An army attacking under the cover of darkness, its approach muffled, its soldiers forbade from uttering a single sound, created an aura of the supernatural. To the sentries on the wall, these shifting shadows were like ghosts, phantoms that materialized from the night itself. This ghost-like advance bypassed rational defense and struck directly at the most primal human fear, the fear of the unknown. By mastering the soundscape, a general held a direct line to the enemy's emotional core. He could choose to induce the frantic panic of sensory overload or the cold, creeping dread of an ominous silence. In both cases, the goal was the same: to shatter the enemy's mental cohesion, leaving them unable to think, to act, or to stand together as the real blow finally fell. A whisper in the marketplace could crumble a fortress that 1,000 catapults could not breach. This 10th stratagem bypassed the enemy army entirely to wage a silent war within the very streets and palaces of the rival state. It was the deliberate fomenting of internal rebellion, a psychological operation designed to turn a kingdom's own people into its gravediggers. Unseen agents moved through crowded cities and army camps, their weapons not daggers but devastating rumors and carefully crafted lies. To the weary populace, they whispered stories of their king's secret hoards of gold while they themselves went hungry. They spoke of the invaders not as conquerors, but as liberators who offered lower taxes and stable rule. The goal was to sever the vital bond of loyalty between the citizen and the state, making the enemy's homeland feel like occupied territory even before a single foreign soldier arrived. The most insidious attacks targeted the command structure itself. A clever forger could replicate the seal of a trusted general and produce a letter, seemingly meant for the enemy commander, that discussed terms of surrender or betrayal. When this letter was intercepted and delivered to the king, the damage was immediate and catastrophic. The ruler, now consumed by paranoia, might recall his most capable commander or even order his execution, decapitating his own army in a fit of distrust. This created what ancient strategists called a fifth column, an invisible enemy within the walls that was far more dangerous than the one outside. The true genius of this tactic was its self-perpetuating nature. Once the seed of suspicion was planted, the enemy began to do the work for you. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust, fearing anyone could be a spy. Advisors hesitated to speak candidly, worried their words would be twisted into treason. The entire society, from the royal court down to the village square, became a tangled web of accusation and fear, where unity was impossible and coordinated defense crumbled. It proved that the strongest stone wall is meaningless when the human hearts behind it have already surrendered. Hannibal Barca did not just command an army, he conducted a symphony of dread against the Roman psyche. His entire invasion of Italy stands as the ultimate historical case study in pre-battle psychological warfare, a campaign where physical victories were merely the final echo of mental domination already achieved. Consider his legendary crossing of the Alps. For the Romans, those mountains were their divine shield, an impassable wall guaranteed by the gods to protect their homeland. When Hannibal emerged on the other side with his war elephants and a hardened army, it was more than a surprise, it was a fundamental breach of reality. He had done the impossible, and in that single act he demonstrated that Roman assumptions, Roman safety, and even Roman faith in their own geography were all illusions. This was the first and deepest cut, shattering the Roman sense of invulnerability before a single legionary was in sight. He then masterfully weaponized the environment itself. At the Battle of the Trebia, he did not wait for the Romans to be at their best. He chose the time and place with cruel precision, forcing the Roman legions to wade through icy, chest-high rivers on a cold winter morning. By the time the shivering, exhausted soldiers formed their lines, they were already defeated. Their muscles were numb, their spirits broken by the elements, and Hannibal's own men, who had eaten a warm breakfast and prepared for the fight, cut them down with ease. This was not a battle, it was a psychological execution, proving that morale could be frozen solid long before steel ever clashed. But his masterpiece was canny. There, Hannibal's genius lay not in his own formation, but in his profound understanding of the Roman command mind. He knew the Roman generals were proud, aggressive, and expected a straightforward, head-on collision of force. So he gave them exactly what they wanted, or so they thought. He arranged his center to appear weak, tempting the massive Roman legions to push forward into a seemingly collapsing line. With every step the Romans took, their triumph turned to trap. Hannibal's stronger forces on the wings enveloped them, and what began as a confident advance became a suffocating nightmare. He had not outfought the Romans in that moment, he had outthought them. He had mapped their pride and their predictable doctrines so perfectly that he made them active participants in their own annihilation. Hannibal's true weapon was never his Numidian cavalry or his African spearmen. It was his intimate psychological profile of his enemy. He knew that Roman culture valued boldness and direct confrontation above all, and he crafted a campaign that systematically turned their greatest cultural strengths into their most catastrophic weaknesses. He fought the war not on the fields of Italy, but inside the minds of every Roman senator and soldier, a victory of perception that would haunt the Republic for generations. Hannibal's campaign was a stunning application of principles, but the philosophy itself was articulated centuries earlier in a single, timeless text. Within the quiet halls of ancient Chinese courts, the strategist Sun Tzu composed a work that would become the ultimate blueprint for the war of the mind. His masterpiece, The Art of War, framed psychological dominance not as a mere tactic, but as the entire purpose of strategy. He declared that the supreme excellence in warfare was to break the enemy's resistance without even engaging in battle. This single idea elevated psychological operations from a supporting role to the very heart of command. Victory was no longer about winning the fight, but about arranging the world so that the fight became unnecessary. This philosophy demanded a deep and intimate knowledge of the opposition. It was not enough to count an enemy's spears or measure the height of their walls. A true commander had to understand the spirit of their army. Were the troops confident or fearful? Was their leadership united or fractured by ambition? Did they believe in their cause, or were they merely going through the motions? Sun Tzu taught that this knowledge was more valuable than any physical advantage, because it revealed the invisible cracks in their foundation. His instructions on deception read like a playbook for crafting an alternate reality for your opponent. He advised a commander to appear weak when he was strong, to seem disorganized when he was perfectly prepared. The goal was to lure the enemy into a fatal misstep, to make them see exactly what they wanted to see until they marched confidently into a trap of their own design. This required a sophisticated intelligence network, and Sun Tzu devoted an entire chapter to the use of spies. He detailed 5 different types of agents, from local spies who knew the terrain to double agents who could be turned against their own masters. For Sun Tzu, information was the general's most potent weapon, and the spy was his most valuable soldier. Every principle we have explored finds its root in his philosophy. Shattering an enemy's cohesion targets their unity. Weaponizing omens attacks their morale. Mastering the environment controls their physical and mental state. Sun Tzu codified it all into a coherent system, proving that the true battlefield was always the mind of the enemy commander. The clash of armies was simply the final, messy formality after the real war had already been won. The words of a priestess could launch 1,000 ships. In the ancient world, oracles were not passive temples of prophecy. They were active nerve centers of statecraft, where the will of the gods was strategically curated for political effect. The most famous of these, the oracle at Delphi in Greece, became a powerful instrument in this psychological arsenal. A city-state planning a war would not merely send a general to ask for a blessing. It would dispatch a diplomat to secure a divine mandate. The resulting prophecy, often deliberately vague and poetic, was then interpreted and broadcast to serve a very earthly purpose. A favorable reading could transform a cynical land grab into a righteous crusade, uniting the populace behind a cause they believed was ordained by heaven itself. This was not simple superstition. It was a sophisticated form of public relations designed to manufacture consensus and national will. The psychological impact on a rival state was equally profound. Hearing that their enemy had the explicit backing of Apollo himself could sow deep seeds of doubt and despair among both soldiers and citizens, making them question the morality and even the viability of their own defense. The system was ripe for manipulation. Wealthy kingdoms like Lydia were known to send lavish gifts to the temple, essentially bribing the priesthood to issue prophecies that aligned with their strategic ambitions. The famous tale of King Croesus reveals the devastating consequences of this orchestrated ambiguity. When he asked the oracle if he should attack the Persian Empire, the response was that if he did, a great empire would be destroyed. Interpreting this as a guarantee of his own victory, Croesus launched his campaign only to be decisively defeated. The great empire that fell was his own. His downfall was not a simple mistake. It was the result of a psychological trap, baited with a prophecy designed to be misunderstood. This demonstrated the ultimate power of these religious institutions. They were not just places to hear the future. They were factories that produced reality, weaponizing faith to shape public opinion. justify aggression, and lead confident kings to their own ruin with nothing more than a carefully chosen string of words. A city under siege was a pressure cooker for the human mind. Outside the walls, the constant grinding sounds of saws and hammers signaled a grim future as engineers assembled colossal towers and rams that grew larger every day. Inside, the defenders watched this patient construction with a sinking dread, knowing each new engine was a testament to their enemies' resolve and resources. This was a war of attrition fought not just against bodies but against time and hope itself. The besiegers did not need to launch a constant barrage of attacks. The mere threat was often enough. The sight of vast enemy encampments settled in for the long haul with their own farms and permanent structures sent a clear message: there would be no relief, no rescue. You are utterly alone. The psychological torment was systematic. Night after night, small groups of skirmishers might feint an attack, blowing trumpets and beating drums to deny the defenders sleep, fraying their nerves into a state of constant, exhausted alertness. Disease, born from overcrowding and poor sanitation, would creep through the streets, a silent ally to the invaders that sapped strength and morale in equal measure. Yet the defenders were not merely passive victims in this mental duel. Their greatest weapon was the illusion of abundance. In a masterful act of collective bluff, a city on the brink of starvation might stage a defiant pageant of plenty. Soldiers would appear on the battlefields, conspicuously tossing half-eaten loaves of bread over the parapets. Butchers might conspicuously wash down the walls with buckets of water, hoping the distant enemy would mistake it for blood from a recent, wasteful slaughter of livestock. The goal was to make the besiegers question their entire strategy. Why continue a costly blockade if the city was still well supplied after a year? This created a bizarre, high-stakes poker game where both sides were desperately hiding their own desperation. The true breaking point often came not from a collapsed wall, but from a collapsed spirit, a defender's failed sortie where a brave group was cut down just outside the gates could be more devastating than a successful enemy assault. It demonstrated the futility of action and extinguished the last embers of aggressive hope. The ultimate victory went to the side that could make the other believe in their bones that endurance was no longer possible. In the end, the strongest fortifications crumbled not from stone against stone, but from despair against will. A lavish gift could be a declaration of war in disguise. Ancient rulers understood that the most potent demonstrations of power were not always threats, but presents. They mastered the art of calculated generosity, a paradoxical stratagem where giving more could weaken an opponent far more effectively than taking anything away. Imagine a neighboring king receiving a chest overflowing with rare gems, exotic spices, and finely crafted weapons from a rival empire. On the surface, it was a magnificent gesture. But the true message was etched into every jewel. This was a fraction of my treasury, it whispered. My lands are so vast, my resources so endless, that I can afford to give this away without a second thought. How could your modest kingdom ever hope to compete? The psychological weight of such a gift was immense. Accepting it placed the recipient in a state of permanent debt and implied inferiority. Every time he looked upon those treasures, he was reminded not of an ally's kindness, but of an opponent's overwhelming advantage. This was a masterstroke of psychological positioning, making a rival feel small and outclassed without a single hostile action. The tactic evolved brilliantly after a military victory. A conqueror who had just shattered an enemy army might then do the unexpected. Instead of slaughtering the surrendered soldiers or enslaving the population, he would provide food for the hungry, rebuild damaged infrastructure, and allow the local rulers to retain some honor. This was not born of sudden mercy. It was a coldly rational calculation. Brutality breeds resentment and the seeds of future rebellion, but clemency, when strategically applied, breeds confusion and then loyalty. The conquered people, expecting fire and sword, were instead given order and a path forward. Their fear of the conqueror began to mix with a grudging gratitude. This appeal to hope and self-interest was far more effective at securing a new territory than terror alone. It disarmed resistance by making cooperation the more attractive option, transforming a vanquished foe into a governed subject. The narrative of the conflict was permanently rewritten. The victor was no longer just a destroyer, but a magnanimous unifier, a ruler of such profound strength that he no longer needed to prove it with cruelty. That philosophy of mental dominance was far from forgotten when the Roman legions faded into history. Across the world, in the thunderous charge of medieval knights and the sweeping conquests of the steppes, the ancient art of psychological warfare was refined for a new age. A knight's coat of arms was more than a colorful identification. It was a walking billboard of calculated terror. When a specific heraldic beast emblazoned on a shield appeared on the horizon, it carried a reputation, a story of past victories and merciless prowess designed to make an opponent's heart falter before the lance ever lowered. This chivalric code itself was a double-edged psychological tool, binding knights in a shared culture of honor while simultaneously presenting an image of invincible, God-fearing warriors to their enemies. No one weaponized terror more systematically than the Mongols under Genghis Khan. Their approach was chillingly modern in its psychological precision. They understood that a reputation for absolute ruthlessness could be a strategic asset, saving them the time, resources, and lives required for long sieges. After annihilating a city that dared to resist, they would deliberately allow a handful of survivors to escape. These traumatized refugees became their unwitting agents, carrying exaggerated tales of Mongol ferocity to the next city on their path. The story of the coming horde grew with every mile, a phantom army of demons that marched on the wind of rumor. By the time the Mongol scouts actually appeared, the defenders were often already broken, their will to fight eroded by a horrifying narrative they had convinced themselves was true. Many cities simply threw open their gates, choosing subjugation over annihilation. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, the principles of psychological control found their ultimate political expression in the work of Niccolò Machiavelli. His seminal text, The Prince, served as a cold, practical guide to statecraft, stripping away medieval notions of divine right and chivalry to focus on the raw mechanics of power. Machiavelli argued that for a ruler, it was far safer to be feared than loved. He advised manipulating public perception, staging grand spectacles to appear both merciful and ruthless as the situation demanded, and always keeping the populace in a state of uncertain awe. This was Sun Tzu's philosophy translated for the palace and the piazza, a recognition that controlling the narrative and managing the fears of one's own people were just as critical as outmaneuvering a foreign army. From the knight's heraldry to the Mongols' rumor campaign to Machiavelli's political science, the thread remains unbroken. The weapons evolved from swords to cannons, but the fundamental battlefield, the human mind, remained exactly the same. A king's whisper across the centuries has found its voice in a global network. The very same principles of psychological warfare that toppled ancient empires are now the invisible engines of modern power, operating in plain sight. In the realm of geopolitics, the false deserter has been replaced by the state-sponsored troll farm. Instead of a single soldier stumbling into an enemy camp with a rehearsed lie, we see coordinated armies of online accounts flooding social media with disinformation, designed to sow social division and undermine trust in rival governments from within. The goal remains identical: to poison a nation's decision-making process by shattering its shared sense of reality. Economic sanctions are the 21st century's version of burning grain silos and poisoning wells. This is logistical warfare refined for a globalized age, a calculated campaign of scarcity intended to pressure entire populations and turn them against their leaders, proving that an empire's greatest vulnerability is still the stomach of its people. This ancient playbook has been seamlessly adopted in the corporate world. A tech giant's carefully staged product launch, creating an illusion of revolutionary innovation to box out competitors, is a direct descendant of the general who appeared weak when he was strong. Corporate espionage and the psychological profiling of rival CEOs mirror the intricate spy networks that Sun Tzu deemed essential. Businesses strive to cultivate a public image of market invincibility, a modern mythos designed to deter challengers just as effectively as a carved stone relief of Assyrian terror. Perhaps the most pervasive evolution is in the architecture of our daily lives. Social media platforms and targeted advertising are not neutral tools. They are sophisticated systems for perception shaping and behavior modification. They analyze our deepest fears and desires, creating a curated information environment that can influence everything from our consumer choices to our political beliefs, proving that the battlefield for the human mind has now expanded to the screen in your pocket. Recognizing these patterns is our only defense. When you see a news story that seems perfectly crafted to enrage you, or an advertisement that feels uncannily personal, you are witnessing an ancient art form in its latest iteration. This awareness transforms us from passive targets into critical thinkers. It allows us to question the narratives presented to us, to see the strategic misdirection behind a political speech or a corporate announcement, and to make more deliberate choices in our own lives. The war for your attention, your loyalty, and your perception has been raging for thousands of years. The weapons have simply changed from war drums to algorithms, and the first step to winning is realizing you are already on the field. This cleverness casts a long and troubling shadow. We must ask ourselves a difficult question as we study these brilliant strategies. Where does smart tactics end and true cruelty begin? These ancient commanders were masters of exploiting the most vulnerable parts of the human psyche. They weaponized primal fears, twisted sincere religious beliefs into tools of control, and deliberately turned communities against themselves. The immediate victory on the battlefield was undeniable, but the human cost was often catastrophic. The very trust that holds a society together was the first thing targeted for destruction. A victory secured by convincing fathers and sons that their neighbors were traitors leaves behind a poison that can linger for generations. This forces a profound ethical debate, one that echoes loudly in our own time. Does a successful outcome, whether in a corporate takeover or a political campaign, make any method acceptable? A modern company might spread rumors to cripple a competitor's stock price, or a political party might use targeted disinformation to depress voter turnout in key districts. These actions are the direct descendants of ancient psychological warfare, and they force the same moral reckoning. A strategy rooted entirely in deception may win the day, but it builds its foundation on sand. The resentment it breeds, the broken trust, the sheer instability of a world where no word can be believed, these are the long-term costs of a short-term victory. Power over the human mind is perhaps the most formidable tool ever devised, and with it comes an immense responsibility. Recognizing the dark potential of this forgotten art is not to dismiss its brilliance, but to understand its full weight. It reminds us that true, lasting power is not just about controlling what people do, but about how you choose to engage with who they are. Holly, would have you believe ancient psychological warfare was a matter of pulling a clever trick from a dusty scroll. The reality was far more demanding. This was not a world of instant solutions or magical illusions, but a rigorous discipline built on a foundation of profound human understanding. Success required more than a single deceptive move. It demanded a strategist who was part anthropologist, part economist, and part theologian. He had to immerse himself in the enemy's culture, learning their superstitions, their political factions, their economic pressures, and the sacred symbols that gave their lives meaning. Every action was part of a sustained, multi-layered campaign. A false rumor about a king's legitimacy was useless without first understanding the deep-seated tribal tensions it could exploit. A forged letter of betrayal would only work if you knew the specific personal rivalries simmering within the royal court. This intricate knowledge transformed a simple lie into a precision tool, capable of dismantling an empire from the inside. The cinematic version focuses on the dramatic, singular event, the poisoned well or the fake retreat. But history shows us that the most devastating campaigns were those of relentless, cumulative pressure. It was the slow starvation of a city combined with the nightly war drums, paired with the whispered promises to its disillusioned governors. It was the patient cultivation of a myth of invincibility, reinforced over years through controlled propaganda and stunning but selective military victories. This demystification does not diminish the ancient strategist's genius, it elevates it. They were not wizards, they were master psychologists. Their weapon was not a bag of tricks, but a deep, systematic, and often chillingly accurate map of the human heart. They knew that to conquer an army, you first had to understand the fears, hopes, and loyalties of every man within it. The grand strategies we have explored were not born from myth, but meticulously recorded by the civilizations that wielded them. Our window into this invisible war is a mosaic of ancient texts and physical ruins, each piece filtered through the lens of its creator. Foundational texts like Sun Tzu's The Art of War and Chanakya's Arthashastra are not merely philosophical musings. They are direct instruction manuals detailing exactly how to deploy spies, spread disinformation, and break an enemy's will, offering us the theoretical blueprint for psychological dominance. These works give us the playbook, but archaeology shows us the game in action. The stone reliefs that line the walls of Assyrian palaces are not simple decorations. They are propaganda in its most permanent form, depicting in graphic detail the fate of rebellious cities, the execution of defiant kings, and the systematic deportation of conquered peoples. These carvings were designed to awe and terrify visiting diplomats, a chilling form of state-sponsored advertising for the empire's ruthlessness. Similarly, the excavated remains of massive Roman siege works, the earthen ramps and fortified camps, testify to the relentless psychological pressure of a blockade, proving these were not just military constructions but instruments of despair. Yet we must read these sources with a critical eye. A Roman historian like Polybius often wrote to glorify Rome's expansion, framing its enemies as barbaric and its own actions as justified. The official chronicles of a pharaoh would never record a moment of self-doubt or a failed deception. They are the records of the victors, crafted to cement a specific narrative of invincibility and divine favor. This means reconstructing the true picture is a constant act of historical detective work. Scholars must cross-reference a boastful Egyptian account of a battle with the more subdued records of their rivals, or compare the idealized tactics in a military manual with the chaotic evidence from a battlefield grave. Every new discovery, a buried fragment of a scroll or a reinterpreted inscription, can shift our understanding. The story of ancient psychological warfare is not a closed book, but a living puzzle, reminding us that the most enduring battles are often fought over the control of history itself. Yet for every clever sword stroke of the mind, there was a shield waiting to be raised. The ancient art of psychological warfare inevitably spawned its own sophisticated countermeasures, creating an invisible arms race as dynamic as the development of the spear or the chariot. The first and most vital line of defense was the individual soldier's own discipline. Commanders knew that a man's fear was the enemy's greatest ally, so they drilled their troops relentlessly, not just in formations but in mental fortitude. They taught them to stand firm when war elephants thundered toward them, to ignore the grotesque masks of their foes, and to understand that the terrifying roar from a distant valley was often just a clever trick of the hills. A soldier who expected to be terrified was a soldier who could master his fear. This discipline extended to the rumor mill. Wise generals established strict controls on information, punishing those who spread unverified news and using their own trusted officers to deliver clear, consistent messages to the ranks. They understood that a single whispered lie about a water shortage could spread panic faster than a plague, so they actively fought to control the narrative within their own camp. Just as they faced enemy propaganda abroad, they waged a campaign of truth and unity at home. To counter the weaponized omens of their rivals, commanders maintained their own stable of seers and astrologers. If the enemy's priests declared an eclipse was a sign of their god's displeasure, your own holy men would immediately interpret it as a portent of the enemy's impending blindness and folly. This was a spiritual duel, a battle of divine narratives where the goal was to ensure your army believed it fought with heaven's favor, no matter what the sky might suggest. The ultimate defense, however, was not found in denying enemy lies, but in building an unbreakable truth within your own ranks. Fierce unit cohesion and absolute loyalty to one's comrades and commanders were the bedrock of psychological resilience. An army bound by shared hardship and mutual trust was virtually immune to attempts to sow suspicion or foster betrayal. A soldier fights for more than pay or king. He fights for the man standing next to him. These bonds of brotherhood were carefully nurtured through shared rituals, fair treatment, and a commander who led from the front. Reliable intelligence was the final key to piercing the fog of deception. While the enemy tried to blind you with false deserters and phantom armies, your own scouts and spies provided the eyes to see reality. A skilled scout could discern that a forest of enemy campfires was too neatly spaced, suggesting a ruse. A deep cover agent could warn of a planned ambush or confirm that rumors of a rival's alliance were utterly false. Knowledge was the antidote to deception. The Romans provided a masterclass in this defensive adaptation. After suffering catastrophic defeats at the hands of Hannibal, the general Scipio Africanus did not simply build a bigger army. He made a profound study of Hannibal's own methods. He learned to use flanking maneuvers and strategic feints as effectively as the Carthaginian master. In one of history's great ironic turns, Scipio ultimately used Hannibal's own psychological playbook to defeat him at the Battle of Zama. He demonstrated that the ultimate defense against the art of mental warfare was not a thicker wall, but a deeper understanding of the art itself. This endless duel of wits proved that the mind was not just a target, it was the most fortified citadel, and its gates could be held. The battlefield for the human mind was never an exclusively male domain. While the history books often celebrate the generals and the legions, the hidden war of perception was waged by a far wider cast of characters, including those written out of the narrative for centuries. Women and non-combatants were not merely passive spectators in these ancient struggles. They were active, ingenious participants in the psychological arena. Cleopatra of Egypt stands as a masterclass in this art. Her power was not rooted in military command, but in her profound understanding of diplomacy and personal influence. She forged her most crucial alliances not on the battlefield, but through strategic relationships with Rome's most powerful men, using her intellect and political savvy to shield her kingdom from being absorbed by the burgeoning empire for decades. Her legendary first meeting with Mark Antony was not a simple romantic encounter. It was a meticulously staged piece of political theater. She arrived on a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Venus, a living spectacle designed to overwhelm his senses and frame their partnership not as a mere political deal, but as a divine union. This was psychological warfare waged with perfume and pageantry, and it proved devastatingly effective. Within the walls of a besieged city, the role of women shifted from the diplomatic to the defiant. Commanders knew that the morale of the entire population, not just the soldiers, was critical to enduring a long siege. Women were often central to maintaining this spirit, managing scarce resources, caring for the wounded, and preserving a semblance of normal life amid the chaos. In moments of crisis, they became potent symbols, appearing on the city walls in plain view of the enemy. They performed acts of stunning psychological resistance. They might ostentatiously polish armor, mock the besiegers from the ramparts, or even cut their hair to weave into bowstrings when supplies ran low. These acts were a powerful communication to both their own people and the enemy outside. They signaled unwavering resolve, a community so unified that even its most vulnerable members stood fearless against the threat. For the soldiers inside, it was a profound morale booster. For the enemy, it was a demoralizing sight, proving that their pressure was not having the intended effect. Perhaps the most shadowy role was that of the spy, a part for which gender and social status were perfect camouflage. A queen or a noblewoman had access to the most sensitive political discussions, while a merchant, a servant, or a dancer could move through all levels of society unseen. Their perceived insignificance in the eyes of powerful men was their greatest asset. A servant quietly refilling wine glasses at a war council could memorize every detail of a planned campaign. A merchant traveling between hostile cities could carry coded messages hidden among his goods. These individuals operated in the blind spots of their enemies, turning societal underestimation into a weapon of immense strategic value. To see ancient psychological warfare in its full complexity, we must widen our view beyond the phalanx and the legion. The entire society, from the palace to the marketplace, was a web of influence and resistance. The fight was not just for territory, but for the very will of a people, and that was a battle in which everyone, regardless of their station, had a part to play. The ghost of Sun Tzu marches in the pages of modern military doctrine. These ancient principles of psychological dominance were not lost to history. They were systematically studied and codified, forming the very bedrock of how 21st century armies conceptualize conflict. The United States Army's own field manuals on psychological operations read like a direct translation of ancient texts, explicitly stating that the primary objective is to influence the enemy's will, emotions, and decision-making. This is not a secondary tactic, it is a core component of modern warfighting, proving that the ultimate victory is still recognized as a psychological state long before it becomes a territorial one. This philosophical thread connects Blitzkrieg to the battle for hearts and minds. The German Blitzkrieg of World War II was not merely about speed and tanks. It was a calculated application of shock, a deliberate inducement of paralysis and helplessness in the enemy command structure. The goal was to create such a rapid and overwhelming cascade of bad news that the opposing government's will to continue the fight simply collapsed. In more recent conflicts, this has evolved into the sophisticated doctrine of perception management, where controlling the narrative through media and information becomes as critical as controlling the high ground. The modern term shock and awe could have been lifted directly from an Assyrian general's playbook, describing a campaign so visually and audibly overwhelming that it shatters the enemy's perception of their own capability to resist. Every general who has ever studied the art of war has been forced to confront this timeless lesson. The physical battlefield is merely the final, violent expression of a contest that was already decided in the silent, fearful spaces of the human mind. This is the enduring legacy of those ancient masters, a chilling reminder that while our technology has evolved beyond comprehension, the fundamental nature of conflict and the human spirit it targets has remained unchanged for thousands of years. This entire journey reveals a startling sophistication in how our ancestors understood the human mind. They did not just wield swords, they weaponized perception itself, pursuing victory through deception, intimidation, and the subtle erosion of will long before any physical combat began. These strategies highlight a timeless and profound truth. Conflict is fundamentally human, rooted in our deepest fears, our most cherished beliefs, and our collective perceptions of reality. While the methods have evolved from war drums to algorithms and from forged letters to online disinformation, the core principles remain powerfully relevant. They urge us to look beyond the surface-level conflicts we see in politics, business, and even our daily lives, to recognize the underlying psychological battles being waged for our attention and allegiance. Let this exploration serve as a lasting reminder of the immense power of perception. We would love to hear which ancient tactic you found most fascinating in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the hidden corners of history, be sure to subscribe for more.